Hi, everybody. Welcome to the OFM Podcast, where metabolic health and especially performance matter. I'm your host, Peter Defty, and today I have on the podcast one of my mentors, whether he knows it or not, Phil Maffetone, who's legendary in the endurance sphere. Phil, welcome.
Thanks, Peter. I appreciate your little intro there. That's good to hear.
I'm going to give a little bit more intro because I think for those of you who don't know who Phil is, he'll tell you his body of work, mainly in the endurance and health sphere. But I want to posit this, that to me, Phil is a true Renaissance man because he goes where his interests take him, and he's not just a legend. I don't think he described himself as a guru, but a lot of people consider him a guru in the sphere of health and nutrition. But he's got deep interest and gets it about how this all is one big matrix. He's currently, his main interest is music, I think it is. Is that correct?
Well, it's one of my interests. I still retain all the interests I've had in the past, but I just keep adding more,
right?
And it makes for a very interesting and wonderful life.
Yeah. So that's why I say it's like you're a Renaissance man to me. You're Thomas Jefferson or Da Vinci, who just you just keep growing your body of knowledge. And there's for every rabbit hole I go down and get an answer to a question, 6 more pop up, and off you go. Right?
Yeah. And if only I could be those two guys.
Yeah, well, I think you're doing a pretty good job. So, Phil, why don't you give us a brief, for people who don't know your resume, give us a brief background on where you come from and who you've coached to success, a few goats out there.
Gosh, I don't know. I wouldn't know where to start. I guess with my birth. No, I'm only kidding. I don't really know how to answer that, other than I was lucky enough way back in high school even to have this concept of the holistic paradigm, and I started looking at everything that way rather than here's this and there's that. I looked at the big picture and that. And I didn't think much of it. I just thought, well, this is a reality, how interesting the universe is. And as I got further along in school and eventually realized I wanted to be in a career that, where I was able to help people with their health and with their fitness, because I came from a sports background and I was very interested in health. So I always had the two together, and again, they were not separate. It was all one thing, really, and so I kept going, and eventually got into practice and started working with a variety of different patients, some of whom were local competitive athletes, 5K runners, 10K runners, and gradually. I realized that, and many of them were injured. That's why they came to see me. I've got this knee problem. Okay, let's take a look. Let's look at let's look at the big picture. Let's look at what you're eating. Let's look at how you're training. Look at how other stresses affect you. And I realized early on that I needed to participate in all the things they were doing. I needed to participate in particular in their training, because their training was hurting their body, and therefore adversely affecting their performance, their athletic performance. So I started training people as part of what I did, not as a coach, because coaches, it's an isolated thing. I did all of these different things. I looked at their training and their competitive goals and what they ate and what they didn't eat and what they drank and what they did, what kind of work they did, their family, did they have a family, and all of this stuff. And it really had to be put together and condensed. And when they say, well, I want to do this from an athletic standpoint, I want to run a marathon, I might think, well, this guy can't run a marathon because he's working 60 hours a week. He's got, a family with 3 kids and all these other social activities. How in the world is he going to run a marathon with the kind of training he's going to have to do? So I sort of, that's where I went. And gradually I started seeing more different types of athletes. In the beginning, it was the running boom was booming. And so a lot, being in the New York City suburbs, I saw a lot of runners. But gradually started seeing more and more elite athletes, and then professional athletes, and then athletes in other sports, virtually all sports I've been in, and other things too. I worked in corporate fitness, helping CEOs. I worked in politics. I worked in it's a boring bio, but that's it. So I've done research, clinical research and scientific research. I have a lot of papers out there and in the journals. I've written a bunch of books, and I have fun.
Yeah, you don't do anything you don't just to slave away for a buck. You just
certainly
do it.
Not.
Yeah. Now, some of the people you trained that back in the early days of ultra endurance were Mike Pigg, Stu Middleman, and then of course Mark Allen. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I saw a lot of people along the way, and I helped a lot of people along the way, and it got to the point where people wanted me to help them, and they were sponsored by companies that were not happy with the relationship between the athlete and me because of the things I would say about certain dietary supplements or sports products. And so it was sort of an under the table thing. And I'm not going to mention any of those names, but it was sad. It was sad that the big business of sports had that much power over athletes. But it was, hey, you do what we say, or we're not going to pay you. I mean, for me, I didn't need the notoriety that I worked with so and so or so and so. I just wanted to help somebody, and they were grateful, and so it was interesting to see that psychological aspect, that social aspect, the business aspect of sports, but it occurred in business, it occurred in politics, of course, it occurred in the military. I mean, it was everywhere.
It's the human condition.
It is, and the biggest problem is the big companies that were advertising in everywhere in society, but sports in particular. I mean, I don't want to mention the name, and I would ask you not to either, but we all know who sponsored the Olympics. And, since the Olympic Games, no doubt, a lot of people have been consuming those products and have been suffering gradually more and more as a result of it. And it's just, it's sad that money has that much power. No surprise. And we have to navigate through that maze and that jungle because we are each an individual, and I have to navigate through with what I want to do, and you do, and our listeners have to navigate through if they want to be healthier and if they want to be a better human performer. They need to navigate through rather than listen to what some what some business has to say because they're selling a product.
Yeah, or
It's very much the tobacco industry of the old days, although there's more tobacco sold today than ever.
well, remember, a lot of the tobacco companies got into the food and sports supplement industry, did a lot of big investment plays when their cash cow was getting hurt. So they were real smart, intelligent, and they took the same tactics into those realms. This provides a great segue because it is about that navigation we talked about earlier. The humans, we're addicted to convenience, and so we've tended to compartmentalize our lives, like you say, whereas people less are just looking at this whole big universe. We're doing the 100,000. My friend Bruce says you're doing the 100,000-foot overflight and seeing it all, whereas most people just focus here, focus there, and that works very well in that what I call that modern man-made construct. But it's not how the natural world works, and we're an organism that exists in this natural world. So I think this provides a really great segue into discussing some of the topics we want to converse about today. Like this big thing right now, you said, these companies, but a lot of these companies sponsor athletes or sponsor spokespeople to get their message out. I don't want us to talk negatively. I want to just say they're getting that message out. So as you talk about this navigation, it's important for the listener to know that, they should be open to the message, but they also should have a balance of a healthy skepticism that compels them and incentivizes them to do their own research. Right?
Yeah, I agree. And not only should they be open to the message, but they should be aware of where the message is coming from. So if the message is coming from a company selling a product and they say, hey, this product's the best product since sliced bread, and by the way, it has the same damage, it's something that we should be skeptical about because there's just no objectivity there.
Yeah.
And so in today's society, especially with social media, we have a problem where we don't know where things are coming from. There are so many articles in running magazines and newspapers and, of course, online that are planted articles by companies that want to give you their slant on whatever. And they get that power because they're buying advertising space or whatever the financial relationship is. And that's been going on from as far back as I can remember. I didn't realize how pervasive it was. I didn't realize how common it was. And at the time, back in the 70s and even the 80s, and I had articles in a lot of these magazines, and it was the conversations with the editors of these publications were always kind of tentative. They were always kind of, they wanted me to talk more about this and less about that. And the less about that was always avoiding junk food, avoiding refined carbohydrates, which is the big thing today as it was back then. And of course, when you look in their publications, that's where they're making most of their money. Or running shoes, when running shoes suddenly became big and thick and dangerous, boy, that was taboo to talk about in an article that was going to be published. That was taboo to discuss that problem, despite the scientific search that you had, or even just discussing it, not saying, well, this is good or bad. It's just that we should be careful about what we put on our feet. And it's just it's sad, but that's life, and that's life today more than ever. And people, the awareness of that is very important. People can't just go on and the first thing they hear about something they grab, because that's dangerous.
It goes back to that Ronald Reagan saying, "Trust but verify." Right? Trust but
Yeah.
verify.
Yeah.
And
And you're going to verify with the source of that information. You're going to verify maybe clinically, and today it's easier to do that with all the clinicians that are out there on social media. But you're gonna verify scientifically, which again today is easy to do. Anybody can get into the medical library and look up studies on whatever. But more important than all of that is that you need to verify this with yourself, with your own body. They're telling me if I do this, that's gonna happen. Well, what if it doesn't?
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, then you think, well, maybe I need to do more of it, or.
Yeah, I want to bring up a really important point about science right now that you'll agree with, because the science has morphed into this institutionalized construct, and of course the money has infiltrated because it needs funding sources, and the NIH isn't doing the same level of independent funding that they used to do. So a lot of it's coming from corporate sources. And this institutionalized thing, it's like today, everything's got to have a published paper. And where's the paper? And the audience needs to know, and they put down the anecdotal. Anecdotal is now a pejorative. Well, everybody's an N equals 1. And when it comes to you're your own N equals 1. And that's still science. It's just science, brought down to that individual. And people need to realize they're doing science if they're experimenting, if they're looking at the literature and seeing how it applies to them. And it gets a little more complex, yes, because it's not just direct cause and effect, as we're going to talk about with the sugar thing. Because yes, you give somebody sugar, they're going to go fast in that moment because of the physiological and metabolic priorities. But what happens later is a different thing. And we're big part of this podcast is to make people aware of that. Immediate cause and effect doesn't tell the whole picture. So, but the point I wanted to make here is people need to take back their sovereignty and their agency over themselves, and that your N equals 1 is part of the science. It's not an anecdotal pejorative.
Yeah, and that's a good way to put it. They need to take back their individuality.
That's right.
Is another way of saying it. And the N equals 1 thing means that I'm an individual and things are going to work a little different for me. However, that's saying everything in moderation. No, not everything in moderation. That's a big myth. How many cigarettes are moderate? How much heroin is moderation? Junk food does not fit in to moderation. There are no scientists who are not connected with the industry, or clinicians who are reasonably healthy and objective, who would disagree with nobody should eat junk food. That's a pretty simple, common sense statement. Nobody should eat junk food.
And everybody knows too much sugar is not a good thing.
Everybody knows even a little bit of sugar is not a good thing.
Yeah. But I would say that we are supremely robust, and the reason we've arrived at this state of health or sickness is because of that robustness. I just stand back and look at this, and it's like, okay, sugar's not a good thing physiologically, but if we're metabolically fit, those occasional hits of sugar for competition isn't the end of the world, but it's certainly not something you want to be doing on a chronic basis.
No, and that's a totally different example.
Yeah.
When they talk about this drink is going to be great because you're an athlete and you need this and blah blah blah. Well, what does that really mean? That means in the middle of a marathon, if you need a source of carbohydrate, it works wonders. Of course, if you train right and eat right, you need a lot less of it in a marathon, or you may not need any of it. But that's just, so, but that doesn't mean that you can take that product and have it for lunch.
Yeah.
or have it in between because or have it before your training. So that's one of the tricks that companies use, is that, this is, and I remember when I started working with with some people on Wall Street, and I would go down to the trading room, and I would, I'd meet these high-end traders and start talking to them about food and what they're eating, what they have for breakfast. And a lot of them were gobbling down power bars for lunch because they couldn't leave their desk. And I said, no, there's a better way to do that. You have your food at your desk. It's nothing magical about power bars. It's going to make you trade poorly for the rest of the afternoon. And
yeah, but the implied messaging of the marketing of Power Bar was,
yeah, you're an athlete. These guys think they're athletes. These women, they're athletes. These are high powered, intense. From 9:30, from 8:30 to, the whole day, Monday through Friday, and some of them even on the weekend. So athletes are very similar. There's a lot going on, but we are individuals, and we've got to figure out what natural things work for us. And so maybe somebody needs more protein than someone else. Maybe somebody needs more fat, more of certain kinds of natural fats and certain kinds of natural carbohydrates. But that's what I'm talking about when you hear everything in moderation, or when you hear the common thing, and I heard it the other day. I was out in public, and I try not to go out in public because you hear these things and you can't help but say something. It was, well, yeah, I'm going to have this big giant thing of ice cream with sprinkles because I'm going to burn it off later when I do my workout. What a ridiculous mentality that we've been fed by these companies. That's the calories in, calories out myth, which is still popular. And you even will see it in sort of a comment in passing in a scientific study. But when you consume something that has a measurable detriment in the body, you need to think twice. And refined carbohydrates are that. And by the way, when we talk about sugar, we're talking about all refined carbohydrates, which when you consume quickly turn to sugar. And that's virtually all flour products in the market. Wheat, rye, corn, they're all highly, highly processed carbohydrates that quickly turn to sugar as soon as you consume them. And they prevent your body from burning fat.
Yeah. And this is a great place for us to segue again, that now that, you've established that your body looks at these concentrated forms of carbohydrates as sugar. It's not just me saying that. It's Phil Maffetone, it's Dr. Edwards, it's all these people that have that basic understanding. What people don't realize, especially athletes, because they're told that they need carbohydrates, lots of carbohydrates to perform. I've done some polling, and like I said earlier, people intuitively know that too much sugar is not exactly good for them. But in the polling I've done, the field testing, focus testing, when I ask people how much sugar they're consuming in the 6 months leading up to a 100-mile ultra or an Ironman, or even a marathon or a half Ironman, they're actually shocked at how much it is. They suspect it's more than they probably is ideal for their health. But when you tell them that they're basically eating their body weight for an Ironman, it's 100. The math works out, the conservative math, not the pro level math, but the conservative math of 2,000 calories a day and 200 calories per hour of training and all that. It works out to 155 pounds of sugar. And for a marathon or a half Ironman, it's 135 pounds. So,
yeah, it's amazing when you when you look at those numbers, but what's even more helpful for people, and I did this when I was in practice, I did it on thousands and thousands of athletes. I had them write down what they ate every day for 5 days, sometimes 7 days, and they'd bring it in on their first visit, or wherever I saw them, and I would look at it and I'd start talking to them, and most people lie when they do that. They can't be honest with themselves.
Food surveys in science are notoriously inaccurate.
Yeah. And so part of my job was to get them to admit that they lied, so they realized the reality of their thought process, the psychology of what they were doing. They're denying, a heroin addict. Or a cigarette smoker. I could quit anytime I want. Well, why don't you? I don't want to.
Yeah.
So the surveys are good, even though they're not accurate, when people are forced to write down because they don't remember.
Yeah. The most insidious part of this, Phil, is that when we look at things like alcohol or cigarettes or narcotic drugs or prescription drug addiction, those get the quote bad label on it, but then this carbohydrate addiction, which it is a physiological addiction, once the hormonal shifts go into place, we don't look at it as bad as a society. It's carbohydrates are wonderful. Yeah, you should avoid sugar, you should avoid processed foods, but the overall message is carbohydrates don't have the level of addictive qualities and damage.
Well, if you look at it from a different angle, if you look at it from a standpoint of insulin resistance.
Yeah.
And I did a study with Professor Paul Larson, and we showed that 91% of American adults were overfat. They had excess body fat that impaired their health and fitness. That's how I define it.
Absolutely. Even the skinny fat people.
Yeah, whoever they are. And it's interesting because even people who have a normal weight, so-called normal weight, and are not obese, 30% of them also are overfat. So we don't want to use obesity because it's an outdated measure and it doesn't really pertain to body fat and all kinds of other reasons which have become outdated. But that in itself, 91, so that would mean 91% of Americans are insulin resistant, which is sort of like a pre-diabetes, but that insulin resistance that promotes excess body fat now trickles down to create injuries, physical injuries, biochemical injuries, mental, emotional injuries, and chronic diseases, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's. So when you're concerned about these diseases, and when you're concerned about the injuries, you need to just keep looking at what's causing it. And body fat is a very, very significant reason why these things are occurring. And then the question is, where does the excess body fat come from? It comes from excess sugar intake, excess carbohydrate intake, sugar intake. So if we really want to treat the cause and not the symptom, obviously we eliminate junk food, we eliminate refined carbohydrates.
Yeah, and this is some hormonal stuff that listeners should be aware of. And like when I work with clients now, I make sure that they insist when they do blood work that they have to insist and they have to push back against their PCP or whoever's doing the blood work. But I insist that besides the standard panel, the standard lipid panel, they always get a 25 hydroxy vitamin D and a fasting insulin. And in addition to that, I always say to them, okay, we're going to use Peter's reference range, not the medical reference range, because when you look at the medical reference range for vitamin D, the low end is in the deficient level. For me, anything 40 and below is deficient. 40 to 50 is suboptimal. You need to get above 50 or above. And the recent literature on COVID showed that people with 50 or above didn't have bad COVID infections. And then on the insulin, same thing. The medical reference range starts at, I think it's been lowered down to some reference ranges are down to 15 or 12. Most of them are up in the 20s. That's the bottom of the insulin reference range. And I'm like, ideally you want to be between 2 and 6, and you can drift between 8 and 12, but once you get to 12 or above, you're starting to have metabolic derangement, or you're getting compromised. And you're talking about right now, if you got pre-diabetes, let's just be plain, you've got diabetes. It's just the most reversible part of it.
It is. It's reversible more so early on, but still diabetics who've been diabetic for a long time and taking insulin, type 2s, you can get them off insulin quite easy if they're willing to do it. There's some discipline involved, and there's a difficult transition because they're addicted to sugar. They're just feeding their sugar habit with the dose of insulin they need, and not the other way around. But I would add to that blood panel, and it's often done, but it's often not looked at, the fasting triglyceride.
That's part of the standard lipid panel.
Yeah, and so you need to look at the triglyceride, and you need to look at the HDL cholesterol, and together they represent the key to all of the cholesterol sugar connections that exist out there, and most practitioners don't look at that.
110%, because that's why I have them do the 25 hydroxy vitamin D and the fasting insulin, because when you take triglycerides, vitamin D, and fasting insulin, and look at the LDL and the HDL panel and the control, it's context. Context matters. And if your triglycerides are high and your vitamin D and your insulin's high, above 12, not reference range, and your vitamin D is low, which actually represents most of America.
Yep.
You're on your road to cardiovascular disease or diabetes or something.
Among other things.
However, what we're finding, and this was shown in the FASTER study on the second paper that came out, if your triglycerides are low, 90 or below, ideally in the 60s or 70s, but your vitamin D is 50 or above, and your insulin is low, like 2 to 6, it's actually elevated LDL is actually a sign of superior health.
It is, and this is what people are still stuck on. We've all grown up around these myths about, in the beginning it was total cholesterol. You shouldn't be over 200, and and all that came from the low fat trend. But the cholesterol, then it was the LDL, and then it was the LDL particle size, and then it was blah blah blah, just a bunch of crap that just was not scientifically sound. And finally, we got to the point where we've got some really good numbers we can look at, the triglycerides and the HDL, for example, if we want to know our cardiovascular health. And nobody's doing it yet. I shouldn't say nobody, but a lot of people in healthcare and a lot of the patients who have to educate themselves need to understand how important these numbers are. It's really, really quite simple.
Completely agree, because, and I'm almost, okay, I'll put on my tinfoil hat and ride here, but I'm almost thinking that the reason they don't put vitamin D and fasting insulin into a standard blood work panel is because between that and your triglycerides, you can figure out like you say, it's simple. You can figure out pretty well where somebody's metabolic state is, whether.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the health practitioner, if that's what shows, they don't know what to do. And what's even worse is that they don't know who to refer them to get help. So that our system has broken down all over the world. It's not just here in the U.S. And it's another important reason why we should take responsibility for our own health. We shouldn't rely on anyone or anything. We shouldn't rely on our health practitioner who works for us, and we should be partners. We should be able to communicate. We shouldn't rely on an insurance company or politicians, or certainly the government. The government, I mean, it takes them so long to have meetings about, we want to change the I mean, look how long it took them to change the recommendations about cholesterol and saturated fat, decades. And finally they made it and nobody even knows it. But the vitamin D is a good example too, because I'm trying to think when I started writing about vitamin D, it was probably in the early 80s. And I lectured somewhere, I want to say 1982, a big sports conference. And I was talking about the importance of vitamin D supplements. And a number of people raised their hands and said, these are practitioners. Why would we want to give anybody a vitamin D supplement? There's danger in overdosing. If they just walk to their mailbox, they get enough vitamin D. Well, not if they carry an umbrella or have sunscreen. And the cosmetic industry, which is where the sunscreen chemicals all come from, has done such a good job in keeping people out of the sun. That has contributed so much to the low levels of vitamin D and the high levels of skin cancer.
Yeah, once again, it goes back to context. And, like I was saying about the whole context in terms of what leads to cardiovascular disease and how that LDL is contextual. It's the same thing. I kind of connected those dots with the whole skin cancer scare, because, our skin is made to absorb vitamin D. And you look at the whole evolutionary process, people who live closer to the equator have darker skin. As you move out, you have people with lighter skin because, those couple months you have good sunlight, you got to get in as much as you can. And it's interesting because that whole thing evolved with Ansel Keys and the diet heart hypothesis. And then, so you're taking away the essential ingredients and replacing them with sugar. And so the skin cells are not going to be very healthy. They're going to be more prone to them. They get sun. These unhealthy skin cells are getting, nuked with sun, all the wavelengths of the light, but they don't have the elements to either process the sunlight nor protect themselves from the sunlight.
Right. It's especially a problem in people as they get older.
Yep.
In particular, but it's in everybody who has excess body fat. Your skin cannot process the sunlight and convert it to vitamin D very well, if at all, in some of them. So,
well, yeah, and those skin cells are obligated to burn glucose over beta oxidation, right? And beta oxidation is a much more complex thing that nobody talks about, because it's not just about burning fat, it's about converting all those other elements in cholesterol into those essential fatty acids that line your cells and build the mitochondria and create the hormones. And it's that big, amazing process.
Yeah. In other words, we need cholesterol.
Yes, and we need to have the metabolic ability to metabolize it, because if you got too much glucose, too much fructose, too much alcohol cutting to the front of the metabolic line, well, the cholesterol doesn't get metabolized. It accumulates, and there you go. Yeah. So let's segue into this in terms of athletes, because most of the people, you're known for your work with athletes early on. You're kind of a pioneer in the stuff I've kind of taken the banner up on. And this exercise is wonderful. We're made to move. But the problem is people don't understand, if you're moving and fueling it with chronic amounts of glucose, you might be accelerating damage versus being healthy. And I think that, except for maybe the extreme pointy edge of elite athletes where winning takes the balance, is the balance, most people are doing this to be a better version of themselves. They want to be healthier. They want to be a better version. And the conventional wisdom, which has been since your time, I mean, I kind of credit you with the guy starting this whole modern fat adaptation. It's not modern. It's just all we do is get people back to their native physiology, as I say.
Yeah.
But currently there's this hyper calorie fueling regimen, and it carries into the diet. And like I said, I've seen so many athletes, and you probably witnessed it too, that would come on the scene and they'd be phenoms for 2 or 3 or 4 seasons, and then plagued with injuries, depression, energy swings, mood swings, etc.
Yeah, it's the whatever happened to syndrome, where you see somebody on the cover of a sports magazine, and then sometime later you think, gee, whatever happened to that guy? He burned out and disappeared. And it's sad, because when we do things right, we should perform better and better without injury, and without sacrificing our health. And that's what people are doing. They're sacrificing their health, thinking they need to push harder and eat fake food. And that's how the pros do it. Well, no, it's not how the pros do it. It's how I have to do it because the commercial says so. It's how I have to do it because my sponsor says so, or this is what my coach wants me to do. And I want to just say something about your comment leading up to this. This is not a current problem. This is a trend. And this trend has been around before. It's come back, and then it disappeared, and it's back again now. And it'll be back again in the future. As long as there's billions of dollars overhead that sells products for great profits, these trends will come and go. And what we talked about early in this conversation is that we're all individuals, and we need to figure it out. And the rules are simple: avoid unnatural food, avoid junk food, and then figure out how you can fit your training and how your diet can support that. And that's what the diet does. It supports the training. It allows us to train more effectively. We don't burn off calories because we eat too many. When we eat junk food, when we eat sugar, we burn more sugar calories and not enough fat calories. And what you've seen in the last 20 years is more than ever. And I've been watching this, this thing from the 70s, but more than ever, there are a lot of overfat competitive athletes, and it has affected the professional ranks as well. And that's really sad. So it's not calories in, calories out. It's your metabolism that needs support, and your metabolism will make your muscles and your cardiovascular system work better. And the brain has a lot to do with it. And if we can't use our brain, we're going to get in trouble.
Yeah, and this is the point, is like this. Right now, we're in this. The trend is reaching sort of that crescendo of high carbohydrate fueling, where people have gone from 60 grams an hour to 90, and now they're going 90 to 140. And there's actually some research and posits in the research community that the ceiling is 90 to 100 for an elite male athlete who's really trained up in terms of being able to harness those calories for performance, and that anything above that is just fluff. And I'm thinking about this, and I'm like, oh my God, this is craziness, because if young males doing competitive sports are doing that and they're getting quote unquote results in the moment, from a metabolic standpoint, just thinking about that and knowing that sugar takes metabolic priority, it means that the way that works to me, the way I'm thinking it works, is they're putting such a massive glucose load in their bloodstream that the body is just frantically trying to push it to all the avenues it can to bring that blood sugar down to a stable level. So it means massive amounts of glycation. Of course, it's shunting in as much as it can to the mitochondria to into the Krebs cycle for sugar. But it's just like I said, the glycation that's going on, the oxidative stress, the lactate load, all this excess monkey motion that's not very efficient is going on, that's actually destructive.
Yeah, and there's a very important part to that. Well, there's a number of important parts, but one important part is that half of that sugar, depending on the person, depending on how insulin resistant they are, and a lot of that has to do with age. So a 40-year-old is going to be more insulin resistant than a 20-year-old. About half of that sugar they consume is converted to fat and stored.
They get rid of it.
And the question is, are they getting rid of it? Are they burning fat in their training? And of course, many of them are not. And that's how competitive athletes who are putting in a lot of miles gain fat. And an overfat athlete is an unhealthy athlete. And again, the tenet, the real philosophy of my training from the beginning has been, do not sacrifice your health for more fitness, because you can have both. You can be a great 100%. Athlete and reach your human potential and do it year after year, decade after decade, in fact. Without sacrificing your health.
And we've seen this with the athletes I've worked with. You've seen it with the athletes you've worked with, right? We've seen this decades-long performance trajectory. Whereas, like I said, you see so many people doing ultra high carbs, both in and out of their diet, their training and racing, and it's a 2 or 3 year to a 7 or 8 year thing when stuff starts to affect them.
And a few of those athletes who are doing really well for that short time are really the exceptions as well, because when you look at the numbers, when you look at all the runners, for example, or triathletes, well, not so much triathlon because it's too new, but if you look at the long-term effects in running sports, 5K, 10K, up to the marathon, you're seeing the amateur ranks get slower and slower as the decades pass. People don't realize that is happening. The records that are being broken are by the 1%, the 0.5% of the world-class relatively young athletes who are breaking records. They're the exception. Don't mimic what you think they might be doing, because you don't know. But the rest of us, the amateurs, over the decades are getting slower worldwide. And it's a sad thing. And I think it parallels what I have seen in body fat content, where America leads almost all countries in body fat. And when you go now, and I've been to places like India and Korea, where you have the junk food industries have taken over. There's no more traditional Indian diet or Korean diet. Everything is junk food, because they want
the upper middle class and upper class are fat in India.
So it's and my study in India showed that 80.5% of Indian adults are over fat. 80.5% of Indian adults are over fat. How did that happen? Well, one of the ways it happened is way back when we were kids. We heard about the TV ads that said, donate for 20 cents a month. You could feed a family of 5 in India. Okay. What were they feeding them? What were they sending them? Big boxes of, big bags of sugar and white flour. And their genetics were changed. And now along come the fast food companies on every corner in all the cities and even the smaller towns in India. that's how 80% of Indian adults become overfat.
Well, and we're going to go down a rabbit hole here, and hopefully the audience will listen. But this is a confluence of things that occurred when we were children, or you were probably a teenager at that point. But that confluence was the anti-war movement, the counterculture movement, and then that coupled with Ansel Keys and his diet hypothesis. And what also confluenced there was Earl Butz, Norman Borlaug, and the Green Revolution, and all the farming and food interests around that when they developed the new rice strains, the semi-dwarf Aztec wheat, and then the new soybeans became not just an Asian thing, but and then all of a sudden in the early 70s we had this explosion of business opportunities that not only were literally fed on the American population, but it was used as a foreign policy tool in developing countries.
Yeah. This is a global problem that everyone needs to be aware of, and it's not just a global problem with physical health, but mental health. And my current paper I'm writing as we speak is one about brain health and how sugar in particular affects brain and cognition and our ability to communicate with other people. And
I think you should also put in the emotional state, because when you have blood sugar fluctuations and you're dependent on glucose instead of glucose and ketones for brain function and nerve function, those fluctuations create, that fight or flight distress response.
Yeah, there's finally, I think, becoming a consensus, and this was a problem I had in the beginning of this paper, and I saw a little inkling to jump into the concept of a healthy brain, rather than all this gobbledygook where they do break it down into mental, emotional, cognitive behavior,
They compartmentalize.
That's important to understand and discuss, but the bottom line is, do you have a healthy brain or not? It's not hard to evaluate the answer, and we can see the trickle-down effect of an unhealthy brain in society and it's happened since COVID much more. We become a society of you're either for us or you're against us. There's no conversation. We don't want to talk logic anymore. You're either for us. If you're against us, we're going to kill you. And I know you're going to kill us.
Tribalism, that fight or flight, harnessing the fear.
It is, and it's really it's become a very and that's what I'm trying to bring out in this scientific review.
Well, we were talking about before we started, so much of social media. This is what I've been thinking for years now, is this whole rise of connectivity and social media. It's chronically pinging primitive fight or flight hardware that's wired into us in ways it was never meant to be pinged. It's constant ping, 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 rather than roaming the savannah, and then occasionally you see some game and you need to go hunt it, or you see some lions and you need to be careful, or we weren't meant to have this chronic fight or flight physiology.
Yeah, we're endurance animals, and what's unique about us is our brain, but what's unique about our physical body is that we have this amazing sprint capability whenever we want it. We don't even have to train. If you take somebody who's completely out of shape and they're walking down the street and all of a sudden it starts lightning and thundering, they're going to sprint for cover. They may not sprint that fast, but they're going to sprint because it's there. It's all they got to do is turn it on.
Yep.
But can they walk 2 blocks? No, they're going to take a taxi.
Right. But here's the thing, we're meant to burn fat as our aerobic energy source for that endurance. And we've metabolically shifted our body to use the fight or flight fuel, that sprint fuel.
Yeah, that's the
even tell us.
that's one of the big downfalls of humanity today, is that we've shifted from one fuel to another. We're no longer the fat burning endurance animals we were for millions of years. All of a sudden, big business says, no, we've got to be a glucose animal. And in college, I learned that we are glucose-based creatures. And it wasn't until way later that I read about fat as an energy source, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I looked into it further, and I realized that this is very, very important. And that's what led me to start thinking about the aerobic system. The aerobic system is also something nobody ever talked about early on in college. They just talk about, the fight or flight, and they talk about human performance, which automatically means sprinting performance. And athletes, the greatest athletes are the healthiest athletes, which is a big myth. But the bottom line for the listener is, what does this mean for me? How could I benefit from this? Because there's so much here, and that, you're probably going to go there, but I'll mention it since we just started talking about it. Number one, stop eating junk food. And junk food is everywhere. But I developed in, I think 1982, maybe 81, something called, I started talking, instead of insulin resistance, which confuses people, it frightens people. And clinicians know about it, scientists know what that means, but most people don't. And so when you say insulin resistance to the average person, they shut down, because number one, they know, well, I'm not diabetic, so I don't have to worry about that. I call it carbohydrate intolerance. And you're carbohydrate intolerant when you're consuming a certain level of carbohydrate that impairs your health. There's a number of places that it can do that. And so I developed something called the 2-week test, which is a food challenge, basic food challenge, that says get rid of all junk food and reduce all the other carbohydrates for 2 weeks. Write down your signs and symptoms first. Your aches and pains, your energy, your hunger, everything and anything you can think of. And then do this 2-week test. And then at the end of 2 weeks, compare the list. How are you now? How's your hunger now? How's your energy now? Are you sleeping better? Are you depressed? Blah, blah, blah. Does your knee still hurt? And some things are very serious, because I caution to, if you have high blood pressure, if you're on medication, I caution you to take your blood pressure daily, because when you reduce carbohydrates, you reduce insulin, and when you reduce insulin, you reduce high blood pressure. And it can happen quickly. And if you lower your blood pressure to normal and you're still on blood pressure medication, you can go into a hypo state with
hypotensive state
pressure, and that's not a good thing. I also, interestingly enough, learned early on that the 2-week test changes hormones so much that women who are not fertile become fertile.
That's happened to several athletes I have.
Yeah.
In fact,
yeah. So it's, it's one of the, think about this, make sure you understand that your blood pressure is going to drop down. And if you're a female, your fertility is going to go up. And it became, actually way back when, it became a fertility therapy for me. And people jump on the band, the women who had been infertile for so long, finally they were fertile, and now they got pregnant. Now they're going to recommend all their friends, because all the infertile people know each other. And
yeah.
And one woman said, "Hey, I want to make a T-shirt. It says, when I start showing, I'm going to have a T-shirt, and it says Dr. Phil did this." I said, "No, it's not a good thing."
Well, you'd be a bigger legend than that, huh? Than you are already. But yes, we've had the same thing, and I call it the metabolic reset. You know, you have to, it's the same thing, and it's based on your work as work of others, and just going around, because people need to reset their metabolism because of what's happening. And like you said, with the whole blood pressure situation, it's not salt that drives it, it's the inflammation from the glucose and the insulin that's driving the inflammation, that's making their cardiovasculature stiff and unable to distend. And boy, when you take that inflammation away, yeah, if you're on hypertensive meds, you can really go into a hypotensive state. But even normal people will get what they call, the Atkins flu or the low carb flu when they do that reset, and we have to tell them, you're going to need to increase your sodium and stay on top of your hydration, because now all of a sudden your cardiovasculature can distend. And that's a big part of the equation for fat burning, because you listen to all the people who are on that front end of sports nutrition. They say you got to use one of the reasons they use to justify carbohydrates is at higher level performance levels of intensity, you run out of oxygen, because for ATP, and it takes twice the oxygen per ATP via beta oxidation versus glycolysis. And so that justifies the glucose, but they're assuming a very static cardiovascular system. Well, if you allow that cardiovascular system to distend, all of a sudden you can move a whole lot of O2 in and CO2 out, and drive the level of fat oxidation that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's a matter of building the aerobic system. That's what a lot of these people do not have. They don't have a well-endowed aerobic system, well-developed, which is what training does. And if they do, they could also, in self-evaluating themselves, see that they could run faster at the same heart rate as the weeks and months go by. That's called the MAF test, which I developed way back when, and that shows you that your aerobic system is getting better. You're burning more fat for energy, which makes you run faster at the same heart rate. What a deal! Now you compete better.
Yeah. And what we found with the fat adaptation, I've taken it to with both the Vespa product and getting really well adapted. And that means all those components, the nutrition, the vitamin D, and aerobic training of all modalities. And one of the foundational things is the math thing. But what we found is, because all of this reverses the aging process, we've had to move up. If you're already on a low carb diet and you start to bring carbohydrates in, you actually have to move the thing from 180 minus your age to 200, not 220, but and it's like the younger you are, the less it applies, but the older you are, we've seen that 15 to 20 beats. Otherwise, they just plateau if they're doing low carb.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is, if you're performing your best, if you're a competitive athlete, and if you're performing your best month after month, year after year, without any adverse health effects, keep doing it. Yep. Unfortunately, that rules out most people. And if you're doing something and you're trying a new training method or whatever, don't use how you feel. Don't use how your first race goes. Use something objective, monitoring your heart rate over time. So every month you get on the track or you get on a road that's marked, and you see that you're running faster at the same heart rate. I don't care what you were doing to get there. If that's what happens, you're doing it right.
Let me do a thing that'll on the surface seem to counter what you're saying, but it's actually a twist to it. And that is, I always say, the data corroborates the experience. It doesn't drive it. So when you use those metrics you're using, a heart rate in a set thing that's you can repeat, doing it scientifically, then correlating that to how you feel, to build that confidence. So when you race, you can go by feel, you can manage yourself by feel, because I think that we become so dependent on quote unquote technology that you see people checking their Garmin all the time. They don't trust their own feelings. But
yeah, I never liked the idea. I mean, where I was coming from was biofeedback. I did a lot of work in biofeedback, and that's how the heart monitor idea was born. It was another biofeedback tool. And in the beginning, I never thought people were going to need to use a heart monitor regularly. I just thought, let's give them a heart monitor for a week or even a few workouts. And when they feel 140 heart rate or 150 heart rate, now they know how to train. Well, that never worked because they're being bombarded by all their friends. They're running with friends. They're being bombarded by the no pain, no gain media. Now they're being bombarded by social media. Everybody's posting their MAF tests. Look at me, I'm a hot shot because I'm, okay, good. You don't have to broadcast it, but it's, and how you feel from a standpoint of signs and symptoms is very, very important. We have a brain. That's what we're talking about. Use your brain. And when we use our brain, we become more intuitive and more instinctual. And now we're on our way to being healthier and fit, and we age much better.
Yeah, and so much, and that's the thing. I knew you were on the same page with me about that. I just wanted to make sure the message was oriented towards developing that intuition, that instinct that's embedded in us, that primal instinct. Like I said, the data, but the problem just with the whole push for high carbohydrates, it's like if a little's good, more is better, and then it turns into a business. But then we're being bombarded by all these devices, heart rate monitors, Garmin's, continuous glucose monitors. And unfortunately, they're great tools for biofeedback, but people get this messaging that that's what it's all about. And they forget that, no, this is to help you become.
Yeah, all these fitness apps are, and the surveys, the scientific surveys show, people get the fitness app and they use it for a couple of months and then they stop using it. What's the sense? Do something that has logic. Use your brain. I mean, that's why we have it. We could use the technology to guide us initially. And if you need a heart monitor, more regularly, fine. Or if you just need it once a month to test yourself, then you're more objective. But let your brain do the work. That's, it's among the things I love about my friend Tim Noakes. He talks about the brain. He calls it,
the central governor.
The central governor. But I just calling it the brain because central governor reminds me of, some mystical thing up in the mountain.
It reminds me of a governor on an engine, a mechanical device.
Yeah.
Speed of an engine.
Yeah. But it's our brain.
Yeah.
It's the brain. And to paraphrase a recent president, it's the brain, stupid.
Yeah. And the thing is our brains are much more stable when we're fat adapted. And that's counterintuitive because the brain doesn't use fat well. But when we're metabolically fit, the liver supplies the brain with the ketones and the glucose at a steady rate to meet the metabolic needs of the brain and nervous system. And a lot of people don't realize that because they're saying you need calories, glucose to fuel your sport. You need glucose because your brain runs on glucose. It's no, your liver will portion that out properly.
Yeah, and more importantly, if the body is always in an unstable sugar state,
yes,
then your brain's not going to get its share of glucose either. And if you're not producing ketones, you're in trouble.
You're absolutely.
I mean, and the people who have that problem are the people who get sleepy after meals. They get hungry between meals. They get ravenous sometimes. A lot of people I had in practice would fall asleep at their desk after lunch several times a week. They would just say, well, it's no problem. I would just kind of put my head down and I'd fall asleep and then I'd wake up and I'd be okay. Well, no, that's not okay. That's called that's impairment. And so, take those signs and symptoms and use them, because when you're well balanced metabolically, and when we burn a lot of fat as an energy source, now we have unlimited amounts of energy. We don't get hungry between meals. We don't fall asleep. We don't get sleepy after meals. We sleep well, and all kinds of things get better, as we've been talking about. So use all of those things, and write them down, keep a diary, keep track of your own body. It's not as hard as you think.
Yeah. And I'll put this in context for the audience to noodle on. It's like the evolutionary pressures that shaped us as humans. It's like primitive man didn't get up in the morning, have a bowl of oatmeal, grab a couple gels and go hunting. He usually got up and went hunting fasted, and he had to perform as if his life depended on it, because it did. And then the corollary to that is that in terms of carbohydrates we consumed, for most of human history, most humans feasted and fasted, which means if they did have access to concentrated forms of carbohydrates, it would be 3 to 5 times a year, not 3 to 5 times a day for decades. And then there people can see, okay, so that urge to eat carbohydrates, it's all in the perfect balance in the natural environment we grew up in, but it's our undoing in the environment we're in today, because we do crave carbohydrates, because those were rare, no risk food sources, and they were only available for a few days.
Yeah. And yeah. So one of the questions that people may have is this issue of overfat. That is the correct term for excess body fat that impairs health. And how do you know if you're overfat? Yeah, you could do a DEXA scan, but you have to do it regularly to see what's happening. The best way and most accurate way scientifically is to measure your waist at your belly button and your height. And your waist to height ratio is going to tell you whether you're overfat or not. Your waist should be less than half your height. Very simple. Measure your waist, and don't assume your height is what it says on your driver's license, because it's usually wrong.
There you go. There you go. Wise words, because and especially for athletes, because the skinny fat phenomenon is more insidious and just as dangerous as being obviously overfat.
Yeah, so is scale weight. I mean, scale weight is just stupid. But yet we still have this obsession, especially with athletes, for good reason. If you weigh more, you're not gonna run as fast. People get up in the morning, get on the scale, and and when they see the number, their day is made either positively or negatively based on that number. But what are you weighing? You're weighing water,
Mostly.
and so it doesn't tell you anything. It's a long thing that long-term thing that we were taught when we were kids, and we saw our parents do it, and so we do it. And the first thing they do when you go to your primary care doc is somebody weighs you. Come on, why don't they just measure your waist? Some of them are. It's starting to change slowly but surely, but we could do that at home ourselves. It's really simple.
Yeah. So what other things would you like to add to this? I want to quote one of the things that stuck with me when we first met in 2013, I believe it was. That was when you were really, really focused on the music, but you've been dragged back into the endurance athletic stuff. But one thing you told me that was really interesting, and I think it is it is tangentially relevant to our conversation today, was you said to me something very interesting about music and how so much of music, and this is over 10 years ago, and it's certainly true today, but so much of music has morphed away from being this amazing creative endeavor that humans do to the tonal quality of a bird that's starting to go extinct. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that. Those are the studies. I compared those studies of songbirds, where scientists showed that songbirds going extinct, in that process of extinction, their songs would change. And I won't go into the details about how it, but the songs changed. They became poorer and poorer over the lifetime of the bird. Melody ranges and different but their songs got worse over time, and they were interesting studies. But as happens in science, you have a group of people working on something here, and then way over here you got some other people. Well, these people were researching and writing about human music, and they showed the span of music from early in the 20th century up until into the 2000s. They showed that music had improved, and by the 60s it hit a peak, and then it quickly started going down, where it continues to do that today. And the changes, the impairments of the quality of music in the, by the late 60s into 70, 71 were the same irregularities that we're seen in the songbirds. And so that's kind of a scary thing. And we all know that the arts are kind of suppressed in our society, all the way, even in school. I mean, they will fund football, but take the money out of music or art.
Well, it becomes more institutionalized, I think, and it goes back to what you said earlier in the podcast about we can't have conversations with people and share ideas and have these open-ended forays where we're tossing a bunch of things in the air and see what lands.
Yeah. And the other problem with music, and we've seen this all along the way, going back to the Monkees. Some of us may, if you remember the Monkees, you're as old as we are. They were only around for 2 years, but they were such a big hit. That was an industry fabrication.
Completely.
And the industry fabrication has been building and building ever since. And today, most of the music people hear today is from the industry. It's industry made music, and it's way too phony. And there are a lot of singer-songwriters, probably more than ever, but they're mostly underground.
Well, you're one of those.
I just came out with my 9th album.
What's the name of it? Well, that's an interesting title.
Interestingly enough, it's called Beware Mediocrity.
Yes.
And mediocrity exists in health and fitness, and that's what we've been talking about.
I would say it's worse than mediocrity.
Well, it in its truest definition, it's what I've been doing since the 60s, demonstrating against the war and against big food and big tobacco, and all along the way. So anyway, the music for me, I think in the very beginning, I woke up one day as a songwriter, and it was such a powerful passion. I literally dropped my career, went to Los Angeles to get into the music world, and I did that, and I thought, okay, this is a change in career. This is interesting. And then I quickly realized that I wasn't dropping my health and fitness career. I was just adding to it with music. And so I started doing more consultations, and it just grew, and I've gained an appreciation for the arts much more. I was in my clinical environment was very creative. So it's not I was without the creativity. It was that, I was in a different world. And as much as I was a music fanatic as a consumer in the 60s, all of a sudden I realized that humans are all humans. We're musicians and we're all songwriters. And I woke up one day and I realized that I'm a human, but I'm not writing music. I need to change that. And I did. So that's, that's now it's all, I'm still doing the same stuff. I'm not consulting as much as I used to. Since COVID, I'm not lecturing or even performing as much as I used to. But I'm as busy as ever. And it's wonderful.
Yeah, you're doing your stuff.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, and the thing I want people to realize is it's part of that whole big picture. It's a big matrix. It's not one compartment here with your work life, your religious, spiritual life, your nutrition life, your sport life. You're one big thing with this huge brain that can solve problems. You don't need to depend on anything else. As I say about what we do, we're guides, not gurus. We'll get you to the mountaintop, but you're going to do it. And don't be scared to go out there. And I think also part of creativity is being open to making mistakes and just running with it, because that's how you really learn. I mean, when you look at children who haven't recognized shame and all those things that get inculcated into them, they'll make a mistake when they're doing something. Well, that didn't work, and they'll just move on to the next thing without.
Yeah. I mean, it's what I tell people about songwriting, and I've taught classes on creative songwriting. How do you write a great song? Well, you write a great song by writing a whole lot of bad songs.
That's right.
And then your brain realizes that and then the fact is, there's always a great song in your brain. And I mention songs because it's what humans did from the very beginning. We didn't do cave art for millions of years, but songs we had because it was our language. That's how we communicated.
It chanted, and we took that from the birds,
and
all the other things around us, the wind.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of good science out there, and but a lot of this stuff is really complex on a conscious level. But as Phil has done with his practice and we've done with OFM, the actual execution is remarkably simple and easy. It's aligned with the natural systems rather than this conscious compartmentalized methodology.
And to really get, a first step is taking a step back and looking at the big picture rather than each little part. That way our brain shifts into a state of alpha, and that state of consciousness sees the big picture in ways you've never seen it before. And now to act on it becomes a lot easier.
Well, and this is interesting too. This is another physiological fact that I've really taken with myself. Is a lot of my work is this. I'm in front of a computer screen, right? And my eyesight has degraded over the years. And I think it's because of that, because when I go out on my mountain runs, all of a sudden I don't have any blurriness to the grain of sand on the broken down granite. Everything, that big picture opens up on a physiological level, but also, as I say, I do my best thinking when I'm out there. It's random thinking. I can problem solve. I just sometimes not so good at capturing it. But
it's how the brain works. And I've learned to, if I'm writing an article or doing research, I've learned to write a little bit and then start pacing. I'll pace around the house, and sometimes I'll go outside and pace. Sometimes I'll be outside for a half an hour, and all of a sudden my brain will say, and then I'll quickly come in and write for 10 minutes. And over the days and weeks, it turns into a better article, better research.
Yeah. I mean, and that's where it starts. It starts with the brain. Your brain runs best on a combination of glucose and ketones. So you want those ketones to be produced by your liver. And we've had Frank Yosa on the podcast to talk about ketone supplements and all that. And he's the one company that's out there telling people real truth. Like, he's telling people you don't need a lot of ketone supplements, but they can help in the right context, because your liver produces all the ketones you need if your metabolism is working the way it should.
Yeah, a healthy body. I mean, people always ask me, well, what about, what causes this? What causes that? Sometimes we don't know sometimes we don't know what causes these signs and symptoms that people have. But I always will say, I'm not sure, but a healthy person doesn't have those problems.
That's right.
And, don't be frightened by the word ketone, because this is something we make all the time. Everybody makes ketones in small amounts. Our heart uses ketones, and it's a very important energy source for the heart, the cardiac muscle. And we just can make more of those ketones when we're eating a balanced diet than when we're not.
Yeah, and the thing is ketones, they're studying ketones, and so once again, they compartmentalize it into studying blood ketones, beta hydroxybutyrate. But when you start looking at the pathways, and that ketones are spontaneously created and combusted in the Krebs cycle, and that they're substrates for cholesterol synthesis, and that the neural cells, the nervous system cells, actually are 7 or 8 times more efficient on ketones over glucose.
Yeah, very much. And people want to, again, you compartment, you put things in a little box. Humans are glucose based. Come on.
Yeah.
Look at the big picture. And it's wonderful to study all the biochemistry of those pathways, but it's the big picture we can't lose, because that's what we take to help ourselves as individuals.
Well, and that's what we can comprehend, because, I look at these biochemical pathways all the time, and it makes my head spin. And I've got a biology degree from Davis. And, I just listened to a podcast by Chris Masterjohn about lactate and how it's alkalizing, which is partially true based on what he was talking about. But just, it makes me realize how much I don't know, but it also makes my head spin. But I can glean a few nuggets from it because I have a biology degree. But it's step back and look at that big picture. You get your metabolism.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. One of the problems in people who do have an understanding of science in different fields, one of the problems is that different scientists, different professors, different clinicians use different terms for the same thing. And I had no idea how bad the problem was. And I think I was in undergraduate school. I forget, but I was taking a biochemistry course, a big biochemistry. It was very intense. And I was studying the Krebs cycle, which looked like the Paris subway system. And it was just I was having a hard time. I knew the test was going to be a lot about the Krebs. And then I was reading, and then I saw this other cycle, and I said, oh, the citric acid cycle. I better study that too, because that's probably going to be on the test. And I eventually realized that they were the same thing. They were just called something different.
But probably at your time, the only thing that was driving it was glucose, right? They didn't have
fat. Yeah, nobody talked about fat.
Right,
yeah,
right.
It took a while for me to realize what they were talking about was that when we eat food, the components are digested, absorbed, and those compounds, glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids, went through this biochemical cycle to produce ATP. It took me years to understand that simple concept, because they made it so hard, so complicated, and in part because they didn't understand it themselves. But those are simple concepts that get missed in the gobbledygook of all of the junk we have to sort through when we learn this stuff.
Right. And the selective bias in the biochem and physiology textbooks was always towards glucose, because it was the simplest energy source to analyze. And I think the light bulb moment for me was all roads lead to acetyl-CoA, right? All your energy substrates right before they go into the Krebs cycle, they get converted to acetyl-CoA, and each one has their pathway. But it was interesting. But that is more than the average consumer should know. It's just that you have all these different fuel sources, and if you just think, okay, the reason we store a lot of fat, and even the leanest athlete has more than enough fat on them to do an ultra endurance sport with and supplement with their glycogen stores and maybe a little external calories. It's that simple. Your body is made to burn fat aerobically, and glycogen and glucose are your fight or flight. There's for that, just that very top end. And you're not going to, and if you learn to shift your metabolism back to that native physiology where it burns fat at the rates we're seeing, it completely changes the paradigm from what the modern paradigm has become.
Yeah, it's very simple. People who burn more fat for energy, and it's easy to measure, people who burn more fat for energy are healthier and more fit, period.
Yeah. And I don't know how much you've been keeping up with this, but when I got involved with this, everybody kind of laughed at me, and because they'd forgotten that guy, Phil Maffetone. It worked for me. But when I made it my day job, that's when I found out I didn't know squat, because it was all about the carbs. But apparently the body of science prior to the FASTER study suggested that the absolute ceiling of that humans could metabolize fat, athletic humans, was 1 gram a minute. And most athletes burned a half a gram or less, right? And that's why they told everybody you can't use fat as a performance fuel source. And of course, you and I were saying differently, but that's what the institutionalized science said. Well, FASTER changed that, but for some reason it didn't get paid attention to. And part of that, I think, was it got paraded out as a keto study, and nobody in the keto camp wants to talk about the limitations in performance of being on a chronic keto diet. And most of the athletes in the low carb diet cohort were actually people I trained, and they trained and performed using the Vespa product and also strategically adding carbohydrates into their diet and training. Not a lot, but they were doing that. And that's how they got the performance. Now, a couple of years ago, I had a little bit of money, and we tested some of the athletes I'm working with. So, science FASTER established that no, humans can burn well above 1 gram a minute. And
I showed that they could burn a large amount of fat, and I didn't measure that in grams, but I measured it on the treadmill with respiratory quotient. So I knew how much fat and sugar they were burning, and I showed that a well-developed athlete, aerobically developed athlete, could burn a high amount of fat even at high heart rates, so 180 heart rate.
Absolutely.
On a treadmill. And that's how I met Paul Larson, because he was with a group and they published a study showing that, where they measured it. This is long before the FASTER study.
Right.
And I saw that, and I sent him a digital printout of I can't remember which athlete I had tested, where we measured fat burning and sugar burning from rest all the way up to max heart rate on the treadmill. And the fat burning went down, but it was still relatively high. The athlete was still getting, 30% of his energy from fat. And so Paul and I, became friends after that. We started publishing things together, and as it turned out, Paul had already been following my program and had performed really well in the Ironman. I think he broke 10 hours. And Paul, of course, was a colleague. They worked together of Dan Plews.
Yeah, Dan's going to be on the podcast front. Here, let me bring this up for the audience. Can you see the share I just put up?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, we'll put our glasses on. We're going to take the vanity out of it. Like I say, a little vanity, a little denial is a good thing in a male.
Well, this is miniature. This is miniature writing. So
Right. So here we have the Venable study and the Faster study, and this was the 2002. And I have two athletes, and this is not trivial. This is like sub 6 minute pace. They can hold over two grams a minute. You see the cursor?
Yeah, these athletes are moving along at a very fast pace. I mean, the example I just gave, the athlete that I was testing was I want to say 5:20 pace on the treadmill, and 30% of his energy was coming from fat.
Yeah, well,
so they're not scrolling.
And these guys are hyper fat adapted, so they can go as soon as they get on the treadmill, they're above a gram a minute, and then as soon as the pace goes up, they immediately go to 1.5 grams a minute of fat oxidation and hardly even any sugar until they get to that upper level. When they start to go at 6 minute pace, but they can go all day at a competitive range. You say that 85 to 90% of VO2 max on fat, and only at this very high level where they're running at low sixes to sub 6 minute pace. And these are ultra runners. Now, the two that were able to pull these kind of numbers, they live at 7,000 feet. So they've got the altitude advantage, which is a big lever. It's a big tool. But this changes the entire paradigm of fueling from back in the Venable study, where the ceiling was 1 gram and most people burn half a gram. And so this is information for the audience to look at, but is it the fact that what's the difference here? We have people who can burn well over a gram a minute, which changes the paradigm. And then we have this half a gram a minute is what most athletes, what the quote unquote, the institutional science said was possible. Well, is it our genetic hardwiring, or is it the fact that we've fed people so much carbohydrate and changed their hormonal profile to where they can't burn fat?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of both. We've screwed people up so much that what you're seeing in an abnormal situation had become the norm in physiology. And I mean, early on, when I was telling scientists that the athletes I was training were getting faster at the same lower heart rate just by training slower, they said, no, that's not possible. Well, it is possible. I thought you were going to put up another image that I sent you, which was the clown image.
God, yeah. I that's a wonderful image. And one of the thoughts I've had for years, and I've talked about this, is athletes should look at concentrated forms of carbohydrates as a legal PED, because that's, if you look at them in that context and use them accordingly with, very discreetly, and at certain times they'll work for you, but because they have all they meet all the definition of a PED, right? Do they enhance performance? Yes. Are they addictive? Yes.
Are they enhance performance short term?
Right. But are there long-term downside consequences for overuse of them, abusing them? And they absolutely meet the criteria.
The clown picture, for people who are anxiously awaiting to hear it, is one of my clinical cartoons, which I've started doing again. And the title of that is "Sugar is the New Tobacco," and the caption underneath is, "You wouldn't give children cigarettes, why give them sugar?" And there's a picture of a clown handing 2 lollipops to these 2 young kids. And behind the clown's back, he's holding 2 cigarettes. I thought it was a good.
Oh, it's a great image. It's a great thing. I'm going to pull it up right now.
There are some people that got mad at that. And I didn't know if they were if they were sugar addicts or tobacco addicts, or maybe clowns. I don't know.
Well, it's the clown world we live in right now, right?
Yes.
I'm sharing the screen. That's
There it is.
there it
Wow, that
is.
looks colorful.
And,
I haven't seen it on a.
yeah. Yeah, and I commented there, and we're going to be talking about the overdosing they are doing to athletes. and it goes back to, this is the corporate capture, because the same corporations that funded sugar in the heyday of cigarettes are now into, food, supplements, anything that'll make them a nice profit.
Yeah,
So,
and the big sugar, big junk food has used the tactics of the tobacco industry from a marketing standpoint very successfully. It was successful back in the 40s and 50s when they had doctors saying, smoke this and you'll be healthier. They're still doing that.
yeah, and so, for athletes, they need to realize that there's this huge disconnect right now, pushing the carbs, but nobody wants to talk about the unintended consequences of using them, both in the short term, because I don't think people realize the disconnect is, it's well established in the medical community now. It's been suppressed, but too many carbohydrates in the diet are the drivers of the big three: diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer.
Well, it's simpler than that. It's that if your body has excess body fat, if you're over fat, you're eating too many carbohydrates, you're in trouble.
Well, you're being metabolically deranged, which is going to lead to chronic disease. And so, but the message in the athletic community is you need the carbs to perform, but nobody's talking about the fact that if you're taking in all those carbs, it's not a question of if you're going to have a problem, it's when and what form. And like I said earlier, if you're doing a lot of carbs and you need those carbs, you've already had the derangement where you have to eat every 2 or 3 hours or get hangry, or you have to take a gel every 30 minutes or bonk. There's serious negative things already in motion.
Yeah, it's amazing how many athletes will not rely on anything during a race, and some of them in longer events. I mean, I've talked to people who are running 2.5-hour marathons as a PR, who no longer needed to take any glucose during the race because their fat burning was so efficient that they had plenty of energy.
Yeah.
So
well, even the elites, they do the elite Kenyans, they do a lot of carbs when they eat, but they're hardly taking in anything when they race.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the fact is, the vast majority of athletes right now are captured into this mindset that they have to fuel because they're burning so many calories, and they're not being told. That's what we're trying to do here is they're not being told they have the calories on them. They're just locked inside, and all you have to do is get your metabolism working properly to unlock that and unleash that power that we all have within us.
Yeah. It's that simple. It really is.
Yeah. And it's that empowering. And so you have to just lose the fear of letting go of those, the security blanket that they've created that
use the brain.
Use the brain. That's right. And you can overcome everything. So Phil, thanks very much. Where can people find you?
I'm most active on maffetonemusic.com. Yeah, my music is there, but I released the clown cartoon from maffetonemusic.com. I release articles there as well on health and fitness and other things. So that's where I am most active, and people can find me easily there.
Yeah. So, well, thanks for being on the podcast. We appreciate
my pleasure
getting a pioneer you on, and I hope we can have you on commenting, especially if you got some new publications coming out on the sphere or a new album, and let's keep this conversation going because it's much needed. As you say, this is nothing new, but it just seems to be moving in a ever more heightened direction.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. I appreciate it.